Hey, hello there. You're not used to seeing my face this early in the episode, are you? For audio-only listeners, I am staring directly into camera and doing the intro myself rather than having visuals over top of this because this episode is a little bit different than the other ones, not because the content is different, but because I've been sitting on it for a long time. We've been sitting on it because after we did this interview, some stuff happened, and those things made me very upset. And I was hoping to release this and do this intro when I had calmed down a bit, but it's been 10 months and I haven't calmed down. It still upsets me. So it's not very often, if ever, that someone we interview becomes national news. But today's guest, Todd Arrington, did just that. TLDR, Todd lost his job. He was the head of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and boyhood home, but isn't anymore. Thankfully, he got a job elsewhere in the interim. But this upset me because Todd is a great historian. He's a passionate dude. He's super smart. He's the exact kind of person you want leading an organization that is meant to bring history, American history, really, really important presidential history to the public in a way that is accessible, in a way that challenges people, and in a way that excites them to do better. And we almost lost that. Like I said, thankfully, he's at a new spot. And this interview isn't even about that. Interview isn't even about him losing his job or any of those things. This is about the history that he enjoys and that we really enjoy talking to him about. So anyway, I know this is a rambling intro and not something that we typically do, but I hope you guys enjoy listening to him too. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, joined by my ever-knowledgeable co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey there.
And we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And Lynn, we have an awesome guest today, don't we?
We do. I'm super excited to welcome Dr. Todd Arrington, who is the director of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thanks so much for joining us today, Todd.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And I will note that you are sitting in an office that used to be President Eisenhower's office, right?
That is true. The office that I get to come to here every day to work is the office that was built here for President Eisenhower that we know he used a few times at least. So yeah, it's hallowed ground, if you will, for a historian.
Oh wow, that's so neat. So are you? It was built there for him. So he built this. You're at the Presidential Library. Can you explain for those who have not visited one what a presidential library is?
Sure. Yeah. So we are one of the libraries, presidential libraries that is administered by the National Archives and Records Administration. And all of our libraries are basically from President Herbert Hoover forward. Every president has a presidential library, and it's the repository where official papers go, where photographs and films and video and basically anything that documents the administration of a president goes into a presidential library, and it's a repository for historians and researchers to come to do research. So this is really the place where people come if people are writing books about President Eisenhower or about the Cold War or about really anything that went on in the 1950s or 60s that has any kind of political bent to it. In all likelihood, they'll want to make a trip to Abilene, Kansas, and visit us.
So what about the public? Let's say I'm visiting Abilene, Kansas, and I go to the museum there, which is fabulous, and I want to come in and see what is this presidential library? Is it something you can just go into and look around, or how does that work?
Well, we're pretty unique in the National Archive system in that we're about 22 acres in size, so we're a pretty big campus, and we do call it a campus. That's how we refer to it. And we have a number of things here. We first of all have the Eisenhower Boyhood Home, which is the home that President Eisenhower, future President Eisenhower, lived in for many years as a young child all the way up until he left to go to West Point. We also have a beautiful museum that basically takes you from Eisenhower's very early childhood here in Abilene all the way up to his time at West Point, his time in the sort of interwar army between World War I and World War II, his time, of course, as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II, and then on to his presidency, and then finally to the rest of his life, his retirement, and then his death. He and his wife, Mamie, and their firstborn son also are interred here. We have a building that Eisenhower himself actually helped design called the Place of Meditation. President Eisenhower, Mrs. Eisenhower, and then their firstborn son, who died in childhood at about 3 years old of scarlet fever. All three of them are buried here. So we have that building as well. The museum was originally created here as a museum. This was when General Eisenhower was still alive, and just after World War II, the museum building was constructed and originally intended to be a museum for two World War II veterans. The mission, of course, changed a little bit then later when General Eisenhower became President Eisenhower. And so the other building that we have here on the campus that the public can come into is the Presidential Library building. So we do have a film in here about the boyhood home that people can watch in this library building. We have some small exhibit spaces in here. We have kind of a temporary gallery upstairs where we put temporary exhibits. But this is where people come when they want to do research, if they want to actually sit in the reading room and have our archival staff bring them, papers. We have 30 million pages of documents here in the collection, 70,000 photos. It's just a massive collection. People who want to do research here have to make an appointment. You can't just show up and kind of walk in. But yeah, the public is welcome here to visit the museum, go through the boyhood home, see the Place of Meditation, and then researchers, of course, here in the library building.
Wow. It sounds like a crazy place, like crazy in a good way. Crazy,
Yeah.
Crazy in a good way. Yeah. It's a lot, but it's a great spot. Yeah, for sure.
Now I'm gonna, don't judge me, but here are my before coming into this call, like before or prepping for this interview. Here's what I know about Eisenhower. General. He was a president after that. Bald. And highways. Like, those are the big ticket things. He was the last bald president, I think. For some reason, that is like my one fun fact that I think is sticking out of my head.
I guess I'll never be president.
You never know.
We need another one.
We could follow
Right?
his footsteps.
Exactly. And I like Ike, right? You knew that I like
Ike, but then I always get it confused with like the Michael Jordan commercials from the 90s. I feel like the public, and this is just coming from like a regular sort of standard American history curriculum. Like, that's what I'm walking away from. We didn't cover Eisenhower all that much. Like, I knew some stuff happened, maybe the military industrial complex speech I covered in like sort of like AP US Gov maybe, but nothing significant, no significant amount of time. Who was this guy? If you were to say, why should people know more about him? Like, make the case for people studying more of Eisenhower.
Oh boy, well, that probably takes more time than you guys want to dedicate to this podcast. But
we're in an elevator, and you got couple floors to convince me.
Sure, my Eisenhower elevator speech. Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, Isaac, you're not wrong. I mean, all the things you said are correct. He was a general. Okay. He was president. He was bald. He did.
Eventually, not his whole life.
Right, not his whole life. Yeah. Sure. Those of us that are bald did have hair at one point, so we didn't start out this way. But anyway, so everything you said is right. I think certainly when Eisenhower left the presidency in 1961, he turned the presidency over to John F. Kennedy, and he and Kennedy were, polar opposites in a lot of ways. Eisenhower, obviously quite a bit older, a grandfather, the last president born in the 19th century. Kennedy, very young, very attractive, beautiful young family, the first president born in the 20th century. And I think that, especially considering, the tragedy of the Kennedy assassination, there's a tendency to really almost skip over Eisenhower and go right to JFK. And I think that, people who do that are really missing out on a period that's really interesting, and in which Eisenhower is one of, I would say, the pivotal Americans of the entire 20th century, and I would say of the entire American existence. I think he's one of the most important Americans who's ever lived. He went to West Point. He wasn't looking for a military career. He didn't sit around dreaming of becoming a soldier or anything like that. He really was trying to get an education. And he knew that the military academies were free. Of course, there's a service obligation that comes with that. after you graduate. He graduated from West Point in the very famous class of 1915, which is kind of referred to as the class the stars fell on. About 36% of the members of that class became general officers, including two generals of the Army, Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. But anyway, he kind of finds this home in the Army and excels, becomes really adept at staff work and administrative work. He's incredibly well organized, and he gets this reputation as a really, really outstanding staff officer. And that reputation, builds over time with a lot of the various assignments that he has. I mean, he works for Douglas MacArthur at one point. He works for John J. Pershing at one point. So he's really moving in some pretty rarefied air there among, very well-known, very famous Army officers. And he's getting all of this great experience to the point where at the beginning of World War II, his genius for administration and for organization is noticed and sought out by General George Marshall, who's the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall brings him to Washington shortly after the American entry into World War II. And Eisenhower then, again, continues to excel and gets this great reputation to the point where when it comes time to identify somebody for some pretty major combat commands, like planning, the invasion of North Africa, planning the invasion of Sicily and Italy, and then eventually planning the invasion of Normandy, Eisenhower is the choice for these things. One of the things everybody knows about Eisenhower, Isaac, you kind of referred to, was as a general. He is the general that planned, was in charge of planning the D-Day invasion. We can, certainly go more into that detail if we want. But by the end of World War II, Eisenhower, of course, is one of the most famous Americans on the planet and one of the most admired, and to the point where President Harry Truman at one point actually basically tells Eisenhower that if Eisenhower wants to run for president in 1948 as a Democrat, Truman will step aside and allow Eisenhower to run. Eisenhower is that popular. Yeah. And Eisenhower says, no, thank you. I'm not interested in doing that. He instead goes and becomes the president of Columbia University in New York, does that for a couple of years. Then President Truman calls him out of retirement and makes him the first Supreme Commander of NATO when NATO is created. And then in 1952, there's this kind of groundswell grassroots movement of people encouraging Eisenhower to run for president. He still never really said, is he a Republican or a Democrat? I mean, he's a career Army officer. They don't, they serve the United States. Their oath is to the Constitution. They don't get involved in partisan politics. And so he had never told anybody really whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. He was not seeking the presidency necessarily in 1952, but there was this sort of, grassroots movement of people that wanted to see him run. And that was really what convinced him, was that it was something that a lot of people wanted him to do. They thought he had something to offer. And even go so far as saying it was almost his duty to run. It was something he needed to do for the country. And that was, I think, really what put him over the top to make him willing to run. And so he sought the presidency in 1952, again in 1956. So, Isaac, I've barely even answered your original question, which was, the elevator speech. This better be a very tall building that we're going up. I haven't even talked about him as president yet. So, I'll stop. And if you want me to keep going, I can. Or if you want to, kind of try to redirect me here, that's fine.
Well, Lynn has a bunch of good questions prepped for the presidency, but and his personal life and stuff. But you brought up something that I'm actually really curious about that I didn't know was his role in the creation of, at the beginning of NATO. I think that's just interesting. I'm curious to know what his perspective was, coming from being the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces and during World War II, having to work with a bunch of different countries and coordinate basically on a global scale that had never really been done before. How did he see, and then doing it again essentially with NATO, that's a similar level of coordination? How did he see the role of America? This, I guess, will transition us into the presidency. A role of America as a member of this global community, and sort of what we are doing and what role we can play internationally.
Well, there's no question that Eisenhower understood and firmly believed that at the end of World War II, the United States had to be engaged with the rest of the world. There was this kind of isolationist sentiment and streak that was popular after World War I, in which a lot of Americans, including American presidents, kind of wanted to withdraw a little bit from the rest of the world, didn't want to get involved in any more foreign conflicts. There was a very different understanding that came about among American leadership, President Truman, General Eisenhower, and the rest, after World War II, which was the United States cannot go back to that. The United States must stay engaged with the rest of the world. The United States is a superpower now. We have a responsibility to the rest of the world to try to help the rest of the world rebuild after this catastrophic war. And of course, it's the Cold War era, so we also have an obligation to be very involved in promoting democracy, promoting capitalism, and opposing communism. The U.S. and the Soviet Union weren't the best of friends, certainly before World War II. Their alliance during World War II was, a marriage of convenience, if you will, in that they were both fighting the Nazis. So they kind of managed to put their differences aside in order to defeat Nazi Germany, which was the priority in the European theater. And, Eisenhower, after World War II, was very, very open with his praise for the Soviet Union, for the Red Army, in terms of what they were able to do on the Eastern Front versus what the Americans and the Allies were doing on the Western Front. So, he was willing to praise them for that. But he also understood that, especially after the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan to end World War II, that this was going to create a new power dynamic. The United States and the Soviets were going to be the two major powers, and our philosophies, ideologies were completely at odds with one another. And so the United States had to be involved in the rest of the world. It could not revert to any sense of isolationism as it did to some degree after World War I. So Eisenhower knew that, he understood that. And when it came time to create NATO, I think he was the perfect person for President Truman to tap to be the first commander of that, because he had so much experience, as you alluded to, with leading this multi-nation alliance during World War II. Working with so many different countries and so many different political leaders and so many different military leaders. His leadership style allowed him to sort of let everyone mesh together. Yes, there were conflicts, of course. Anytime you're dealing with somebody like Montgomery or Patton, of course, these are big personalities. There's going to be conflicts. He had worked for MacArthur at one point, so clearly, dealing with big personalities was something he could handle. He handled that all very deftly, and so I think it was a natural for him, because of all that experience, and because he was so well respected, and because he had such a sort of a level-headed view of America's place in the world. I think it was a natural for President Truman to tap him as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO when it was first created.
Right. And where do you think his leadership style came from? I know he learned a lot of interesting things at West Point. A lot of good stories. A book I will recommend is At Ease, which was Eisenhower's autobiography. Great stories, absolutely fascinating. But it feels like part of his leadership style most likely stemmed from that, or was it maybe from his childhood? Where do you think he got this leadership style? And can you talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, well, I think all of the above. First of all, he grew up in a large family, in a fairly small home. So there were mother and father and six boys. So it's a large family. So he has to, certainly in a family of that many brothers, you have to know how to defend yourself, and you have to probably learn how to compromise, and you have to learn how to, articulate your argument as to why you should get something versus your brother or whatever. So, I think childhood in a family like that, in a place like Abilene, Kansas, certainly created who he was. He took that to West Point, and that's where he learned how to, of course, be a soldier, how the Army, what the Army considered important for leadership. And then I think a lot of the assignments that he had over time as he built this military career, as he worked toward becoming the Supreme Allied Commander, I think so many of these experiences, like working for Douglas MacArthur, like working for John J. Pershing, like being, a staff officer for General Fox Connor down in the Panama Canal Zone. That was probably one of the most important assignments Eisenhower had. I don't know how many people today know the name Fox Connor, but he was extremely important to Eisenhower's development as a leader and as an Army officer. And, he and Connor would talk for hours on end about history and politics and all these different military theory, military history. And, at one point, Eisenhower said that working for General Connor was basically like a graduate course in military studies and humanities. And so this was a really important aspect, a really important assignment that he had during his time as a younger officer. And then just all of these experiences he had leading up to, there was at one point fairly early on in his career, Eisenhower was actually a little unhappy because he didn't serve overseas in World War I. He stayed stateside the entire time. And part of the reason that he stayed stateside was because he was already regarded as someone who was very good at administration, at organizing, at building new camps and building up new units. And so he ended up being put in charge of some assignments that didn't allow him to go overseas, most notably Camp Colt, which was an Army tank training facility in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is very much a part of Eisenhower's story later on. But, Eisenhower at one point was basically saying that everything he had learned at West Point, everything he had learned thus far as an officer in the active Army, told him that the only way you really become a true leader is by leading soldiers in combat. And he had not had that experience. He didn't feel like, mastering military paperwork was as important a skill. However, as more time went by, he did eventually come to realize he had something to offer and that the skills that he had really were important. And he understood certainly that those skills were important to the Army. They were very much needed. And they were things that he knew he could do well and that helped him advance in his career. So he was ambitious, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. He certainly wanted to continue to grow and become a better officer and become a better soldier. So I don't think, ambition is sometimes regarded as something kind of dirty that people shouldn't be too ambitious. And I think ambition can be a very good thing if it's used in the right way. But at any rate, all of these things sort of led him to becoming the guy that was the natural choice to be the Supreme Allied Commander for the Normandy invasion. General George Marshall, who was the Army Chief of Staff, he thought he kind of wanted, Marshall himself wanted to lead that invasion. And Marshall was similar to Eisenhower in that he was regarded as kind of a master of administration and organization. And President Roosevelt told Marshall, "You're too valuable here in Washington. I can't spare you. You're not going to do it. Who would you recommend?" And Marshall immediately said Eisenhower.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty modern, I guess he was probably ahead of his time. But I can imagine like growing up and being sort of in the presence of leaders like, TR or something like that, who you're like, yeah, I gotta be on the horse in the fray, right? Like, how else is anyone gonna respect like that model? But then he is really like a model. What his career ended up being is a model of a modern general. Like they oftentimes are because it requires different skills than being in combat on the ground. It's so sophisticated and so complex that person who can sort of coordinate all of those things is a very different kind of person than a person who can make quick decisions under heavy pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, being an officer, especially when you get into the much higher ranks like, colonels and generals and such, it is a highly political atmosphere. And I don't necessarily mean political in a bad way, just you've got to know the right people, you've got to get the right assignments, and you've got to show that you have the capability to handle these types of tasks. And certainly those are things that Eisenhower was really skilled at doing. And again, the Army, before the interwar Army between World War I and World War II had reverted to being a fairly small force, not as small as it was before World War I. But, Eisenhower is becoming somebody who's got a really good reputation in an army that is not that big. And then as the Army continues to grow, as America mobilizes to enter World War II, his star continues to rise, and he continues to get these really good assignments, to the point where, again, Marshall, without hesitation, says Eisenhower is the person to lead Operation Overlord.
Well, I imagine that both sides of his generalship, both being able to make those decisions in the battlefield, but also being organized and being able to work with people and all that, really helped him with the presidency, because I feel like both of those it seems like he had both, and I don't know if that's what made him such a perfect candidate for the presidency, but what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, he took a lot of lessons learned from nearly 40 years in uniform to the presidency. In fact, Eisenhower is the president who created the position of White House Chief of Staff. That Chief of Staff role that came from the military, the organization of the military, of the Army. So, he certainly brought all of these things that he had learned over all of these decades in uniform to the presidency, but he also, had great respect for the Constitution. He understood that the president is a civilian, is not a soldier. He worked very well with military leaders during his presidency, but he understood that they were the ones that now were making, the decisions on a lot of things that Eisenhower himself had to make decisions on at one point earlier in his career. It's interesting, too, to note that, during his presidency, Eisenhower did not call for, a massive buildup of conventional forces or anything like that. He actually decreased, military forces, decreased traditional defense spending. Of course, nuclear weapons were then part and parcel of the American arsenal and the Soviet arsenal, which is, one of the reasons these two sides continued to build up their numbers of weapons, was simply because the other side was doing the same thing. So Eisenhower, of course, did contribute to building up the American arsenal. But Eisenhower also is the president who made a very famous speech early in his presidency that we refer to as the Atoms for Peace speech, where he made a speech at the United Nations and said, this nuclear power can be used for so many good things, not just for building weapons. This is the famous speech where he referred to, for every bomber that is built, every ship that is launched, a child goes hungry. I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the verbiage exactly, but it's a fairly well-known speech. But while he is recognizing that we have to be alert because we're fighting a Cold War, we're in opposition to the Soviets in terms of capitalism versus communism, there is also an opportunity here to do something good with this technology. And use it to improve the world. And that's one of the reasons that we are fond of saying here that, Eisenhower was a man of war, in that he served so many years in the Army, but he wanted to be remembered as a man of peace. We have a really beautiful statue of General Eisenhower on our grounds here, between our museum building and our library building. And right in the ground in front of the statue are the words "Champion of Peace." So he wanted to be remembered as a man of peace, not as a man of war.
Well, and one of my favorite quotes from him is the "I hate war as only a man who has fought one can." I may have butchered that a little bit, but I like it because it's taking the sort of romanticism and heroism out of war. And not to say that there aren't heroes in war, there always are, but that if it's something that is thrust upon you, yes, you want to fight, you want to win, but it's not something you want to go out and seek.
Yeah, I think, it's that quote, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can," is very prominently featured in our museum, in our sort of towards the end of our World War II gallery. And it's really neat in that the words "I hate war" are very large, and inside all of the letters are photos from World War II. And there's some of the more disturbing photos, concentration camp survivors, the atomic bomb exploding, things like that really talk about the horror of war and the futility of war. And, Eisenhower, I think, is a great example of someone who at least raised our consciousness a little bit to recognize what the cost of war really is, not just the monetary cost, but the cost in human life, the cost in material, the cost in destruction. And can't we do better than this? And one of the things he was proudest of in his administration was ending the Korean War, which the armistice was signed just about 6 months into Eisenhower's presidency, and not getting the United States engaged in any other conflicts during his presidency. Yes, during his time in office, we started, the Americans started helping the French financially in Vietnam. Of course, we all know where that eventually led, but in terms of deploying soldiers on the ground and getting any of those American troops killed, that didn't happen during Eisenhower's presidency. And he was very proud of that he was able to forward this conversation about peace and the necessity of peace and why peace is so much more preferable than war.
I actually think that the speaking of another area of history that is oftentimes overlooked, but ending the Korean War is actually a really interesting thing in that an American president, just thinking about it politically in terms of how people might respond to that, because it was an armistice. It wasn't a victory in the same way that World War II was. He sort of accepted the line that we're at. It's like we're better off stopping outright than trying to win. And that's a really interesting, it speaks to what you were talking about, Lynn, as far as his perception of war and whether it's worth it and what the costs are, even at the cost of victory. Even I didn't realize that was at the very beginning of his that soon after he became president.
Yeah, he became president in January of '53, and then the armistice was signed in July. So, yeah, I mean, while he was running for president in the '52 race, he very famously said, "I shall go to Korea and basically see what is going on there." Because at that point, that war had basically, become a stalemate. The lines were not that much different than what they had been at the beginning. The first 6 months or a year of that war, there was a lot of back and forth, but then it kind of ground down into this stalemate. And so Eisenhower pledged during his campaign that he would go to Korea. He would see what was going on. I should also add his son, John, was fighting in the Korean War. His son, John, who graduated from West Point on June 6, 1944, on D-Day, was then a few years later was fighting in Korea. So Eisenhower went to Korea. He saw the situation firsthand. He went in December of 52 after he had won the election, but before he was inaugurated. And he saw what was going on there and just decided, basically, Isaac, kind of as you described it, it's not, this isn't worth it. The better option for us is to end this as soon as we can. And so he was, again, very proud of the fact that under his administration, that war came to an end.
I think there are a lot of really interesting things that happened during Eisenhower's presidency that I also didn't know until I sort of took that dive deeper into
I think, like you
his
said,
administration.
JFK casts a large shadow
Yeah,
for historical inquiry that
right.
probably we should look past.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, you're absolutely correct because things NASA, highways, you have the Little Rock incident. This is all under his administration. So do you want to talk about some of the things that probably Americans didn't learn in schooling that we all take for granted today that, Eisenhower either created or had a role in during his administrations?
Yeah, wow. I mean, again, it's a very eventful 8 years. I think there's a tendency to view the 50s as kind of boring. It's post-war. Everybody's, moving out of the cities and moving into the suburbs, and people are
Leave
working.
it to Beaver.
Yeah, leave it to Beaver. Yeah, there you go. Leave it to Beaver. Everybody's working towards, their own little house in the suburbs and getting a new car, and, veterans coming home and using the GI Bill to go to college and then get married, have families, get government loans, GI Bill loans to buy homes and all that. So there's this tendency to think of the 50s as boring, and that is just simply not the case. It's an absolutely pivotal decade in the American experience. And there's, again, so many things happened during those 8 years that I think a lot of people probably maybe have heard a little bit about, but just don't realize, oh, yeah, that was while Eisenhower was president. Mm-hmm. You mentioned highways, Lynn. Yeah, he's the president that signed the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, created the modern interstate highway system. And oh, by the way, that goes back to some of his earlier experiences. After World War I, he was part of this transcontinental motor convoy that was something that the Army ran. They basically were moving military vehicles from the East Coast to the West Coast, and it took 62 days to get from the East Coast to the West Coast. The roads were terrible. The vehicles kept breaking down. Eisenhower was on that convoy, so he had this experience in his mind. The other thing that really affected that was being in Germany during and then after World War II. He saw the Autobahn and realized that this is an idea that could work in America. And of course, there was a defense angle to it in that, we need good roads in this country in case we do need to move vehicles to different places. We need to evacuate
Russia's
civilians.
On the west side.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
we're fighting all over the Atlantic. We got to move stuff together.
Yeah, exactly. And so there was certainly a defense angle to it, but that is something that took place when people get in their cars every summer and go on a big road trip, hopefully to Abilene, Kansas to visit us or wherever they're going. That is not quite as good. They're driving on the interstate highway system. It's called the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. You mentioned the Little Rock incident. That happened in 1957. The Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that ruled that separate but equal facilities are unconstitutional. That took place in 1954 under President Eisenhower. He very openly said, that is the law of the land according to the Supreme Court, and we will enforce that. 3 years later, Little Rock, Arkansas, they're trying to integrate Little Rock Central High School. That is not something that a lot of the folks in Little Rock wanted. There were protests. Eisenhower deployed troops to Little Rock to ensure that school was desegregated, to ensure that those children had the safe opportunity to get into the school and go register at that school and attend classes. Eisenhower is also the president that signed the first civil rights bill since Reconstruction. And it wasn't a perfect bill. It wasn't everything that he wanted. He had to compromise on some of these things, but he signed that bill. The 50s were an absolutely critical decade in our experience as Americans. And Eisenhower again is an older man. Even when he's president, he's very grandfatherly, both literally and figuratively. He called his political philosophy the middle way, the middle road, and talked about, being on the far left or the far right, that's the gutters. The middle way is the middle road. That's where all the good road is. So here we are back to another road analogy, I guess. But and that worked very well for America in those 8 years. It was not a perfect 8 years. There certainly were plenty of people who were not able to experience the full prosperity, the economic prosperity of the era. There were obviously still civil rights issues that were going on. It was not perfect by any means, but I think it's a period of time that is very important for people to know about and to study. And again, I think a lot of these things that happened during this time period, people know a little bit about them at least. They just maybe don't associate Eisenhower with those, but we're here to help them. We're here to help educate them about that.
And admittedly, we've just been talking about it a little bit in the passive voice. Some of these,
well, I'm a historian. I shouldn't use passive voice. I apologize.
Yeah, they happen, whatever. But so, I mean, like the Brown versus Board of Education, it wasn't just that he said this is the law of the land based on the Supreme Court. He appointed Earl Warren.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't like it just sort of happened under his purview with his other branch of government. Whatever. He appointed the Chief Justice that was, that oversaw that exact thing. So it wasn't like a passive engagement with history. These things happened because he was president at some level, not
sure.
just he doesn't have to preside over them.
No, you're absolutely right. He did appoint Earl Warren. Another thing that happened during this time period that a lot of people kind of criticize Eisenhower for is McCarthyism. There was a lot of, obviously everybody knows about Joseph McCarthy and sort of the Red Hunts, the Red Scare, whatever you want to call it, after World War II, and McCarthy claiming that, the government had been infiltrated by communists and going after the army and all this stuff. There were people at the time, and frankly, there are historians now who say Eisenhower probably could have done more to shut McCarthy down, should have done more to shut McCarthy down. I don't know about any of that. I know what Eisenhower said, which was that he was not going to dignify some of this stuff with a comment. His exact quote was, "I'm not going to get down in the gutter with that guy." he was, I think Eisenhower had seen people like McCarthy before, probably some in the Army, maybe in other facets of his life. Eisenhower had a very good sense that McCarthy was going to become his own worst enemy. He was going to make a mistake. He was going to, if you give him enough rope, he'll hang himself, that kind of attitude. And that's exactly what happened eventually. So McCarthy did kind of destroy himself. So I think in that way, Eisenhower's view on that can be at least somewhat justified that, hey, let's just let this play out and this guy's going to self-destruct. And that is what happened. Whether or not that was the right move, I'm not saying it was or it wasn't. I'm just saying I think Eisenhower had even though people thought he was just ignoring it, he did have a strategy. He was going about dealing with it in his own way. And eventually he was right. McCarthy did self-destruct. But, McCarthyism is one thing that historians and contemporaries at the time sort of criticized Eisenhower for. So again, I don't mean to say he was a perfect man or a perfect president. He certainly was not. None of us are. But I just think overwhelmingly his record is very good and very positive.
Yeah, it's a tough position to be in given the context of all of that, because there was a very real geopolitical adversarial relationship between the United States and the USSR. So for him to say, I don't know how much you could, and the McCarthyism was sort of like blown up out of that very real thing into very fictitious, sort of fanciful versions of that. But I don't know how maintaining the truth of it while also, I don't even know how. That's a very difficult sort of by dignifying it with a response, he's sort of getting into the weeds of where's the line here? Because he has to actually maintain the position of that we need to be protecting ourselves from, aggression from the USSR in various ways. But, but this guy is not right. But they probably were difficult to de-entangle.
Sure. Yeah. There were plenty of Republicans who were not thrilled about Eisenhower being the nominee in 1952. Foremost among those, Robert Taft, who was a senator from Ohio, because everyone assumed Taft would be the Republican nominee in 1952 until Eisenhower jumped into the race. Because he was Eisenhower, this very well-known, well-admired figure, a lot of people have this idea that, well, when he decided to run, it was a cakewalk to the nomination. That's not true. He had to fight very hard. Robert Taft was very much entrenched at the top of the Republican pecking order. In fact, his nickname was Mr. Republican. I mean, you can't be much more Republican than that, I guess. So, I mean, Taft already had delegates lined up. He was going to be the nominee. And then there's this, as I mentioned earlier, there's this groundswell of support for Eisenhower and this view from people that Eisenhower is the right person that can, do something positive for the country. So when Eisenhower gets into the race, he still has to fight very hard to win the nomination. I mean, imagine the sort of what his reputation would be today if he had said, okay, fine, I'll run, and then not won the nomination. I doubt we'd be sitting here having this conversation. That probably would have been, knowing Eisenhower, I think that probably would have been the only time he tried to do that. I'm not sure he would have come back in 56 and wanted to try again. But, there were certainly plenty of Republicans like Taft who were far more conservative, far more isolationist in their thoughts about foreign relations, at least, who didn't think Eisenhower was going about this the right way. They thought that the United States needed to revert to that sort of isolationism that we saw more so after World War I. Not every Republican was excited about Eisenhower as the candidate, but again, he followed that middle way, as he called it, and it seemed to work very well for the country for the 8 years he was in office for the most part. And yes, there were some economic downturns and things like that, which I think are always to some degree possible and can happen, that a president only has so much control over. But again, overwhelmingly, I think the 8 years are considered very successful. Certainly among historians, Eisenhower's reputation has undergone a complete 180, if you will, since he left the presidency. When he left the White House at the beginning of 1961, he was viewed as maybe an average president.
Really?
Oh yeah. He, a lot of columnists were like, well, okay, yeah, he was fine. He seemed like he was more interested in playing golf than governing, but and he's this nice grandfatherly guy again. and that was kind of the line on Eisenhower for a long time. That could also be why, depending on how far back you want to go, why some people didn't get a lot of really good in-depth 1950s Eisenhower history in their history classes, kind of like you mentioned at the beginning. But as more time has gone by, and as more and more documents here in this facility in Abilene, Kansas, have been declassified, and historians have been able to come here and do this research and assess this presidency, they have completely changed their view of Eisenhower. He, whereas they viewed him as kind of aloof and, wanting to play golf more than anything else before, now they realize, wow, this guy was deeply, deeply involved in every single thing that his administration was doing. He attended 90% of all the National Security Council meetings over the course of his 8 years. He had a hand in everything. The difference is Eisenhower was not on TV every single day telling the American people, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is why it's working or not working. We kind of expect that from presidents now because that's what we've had really from, I'd say, Kennedy on. We're used to now seeing the president every single day. And that just wasn't the case with Eisenhower. Although I will note Eisenhower was very good on TV. In fact, he won an honorary Emmy for his use of television while he was president. Yeah, we have a little honorary Emmy in our on display in our museum, which is very cool. But Eisenhower just wasn't in your face every day talking about what his administration was doing. So whereas he was once viewed as this sort of average at best, middle of the road president, he's now, historians now rank him as the 5th greatest president in American history. And so, Lincoln and Washington are always 1 and 2.
Sure.
They sometimes flip on some surveys. Sometimes it's Washington. Usually it's Lincoln, then Washington, but sometimes they flip. FDR is number 3. Theodore Roosevelt is at number 4, and then Eisenhower is at number 5. As the director of this library, I have to say, I think, again, a lot of that is because of the research that historians are able to do now in this facility, because of just a massive collection of documents and photographs and films and everything that we have. And if you want to research Eisenhower, you can find things about his early life all the way up to his death. But in terms of presidential historians, they do new rankings every 4 years when there's an inauguration. C-SPAN, at least, the C-SPAN rankings, I believe, are the ones that I recall seeing that had him at number 5. So he's definitely made a catastrophic, or sorry, don't use catastrophic. He's definitely made a very impressive leap up the rankings.
Cataclysmic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like a terribly monumental. I don't know, I'm trying to think of more negative words.
Yeah.
But he's skyrocketing.
Yes, he has skyrocketed up the rank.
I know. He had in. I'm going to tease this a little bit because I'm going to ask a question before I hand it off to Lynn to ask more questions about her. But he had a wonderful partner in his life that I want to make sure we leave time to talk about. But I did have one question that I wanted to ask about going from being a military leader to being a president. Because so it's one thing, I guess, if you're like a captain or something like that, where you're a commander, but not a general. I didn't realize that Eisenhower's only one of 3 that have ever become president. Technically, I think I guess there's major generals, but when we're talking generals, it's Washington, Grant, and him.
What about Jackson? Do you count Jackson in there?
He's a major general, technically. So,
so you're talking about like a full 4-star or 5-star? Yeah, okay.
Full-fledged, like I'm one of the 24 people in charge of this whole.
Got it.
This whole shebang. I'm curious to know if that's. Because it seems to me that what you've described from Eisenhower is that the position gives you a lot of the skills to be president. The first one that the whole position is modeled after is sort of built on that idea. And I'm shocked, actually, looking back, that there aren't more people that come from a military background and move into like a political area at this level, right? Is there something? Did he have any opinions about that? Because moving from like, hey, you're moving from a military to a civilian position, but like you used to be in charge of the army, but now you're not, but you are at the same time. Is there something inherently difficult about that? Like, why don't we see that more often in throughout history? Because you don't see a ton of generals even running for the position. It doesn't happen very often.
Well, there certainly were some other generals. Winfield Scott ran at one point. Winfield Scott Hancock ran at one point. Interesting that these two guys with very similar names both ran and lost.
Mm-hmm.
So there certainly have been others that have tried. I think the comparison between Grant and Eisenhower is really interesting. Both generals, both revered for bringing victory in these major conflicts, the Civil War and World War II. Neither had ever been elected to public office prior to being elected president. Both, had this experience of nobody really knowing what their political affiliation even was. Grant was the same way. He didn't really tell anyone he was a Republican until he said, I'm going to run as a Republican. And Grant also is another president whose reputation has undergone something of a rehabilitation and is now considered a far better president than he's ever been given credit for. I know that, there was for years and years, it was all about, there were so many scandals and all this stuff. He's now getting a much needed reassessment in terms of civil rights. And he created the Department of Justice to fight the KKK and stuff like this. So Grant and Eisenhower both, I think, are benefiting from some fresh looks from historians. And I think both are well deserved. But, Eisenhower or Grant, the military command structure is in some ways similar and in some ways very different than the civilian command structure that you lead as president, as the head of the executive branch and all this. So, I think that especially for Eisenhower, at least, I think just all of these different experiences that he had and all of these different ways that he was challenged and rose to the challenge and learned how to be a strong leader and learned that, who cares who gets the credit? Let's just get the job done. And then I think the other thing, too, and about Eisenhower and there's a great, story about this from the World War II period, but that also carries into his presidency is Eisenhower as the ultimate example of someone who is fully taking responsibility for everything that happens in his administration and taking accountability and saying, I am the one, whether it's talking about, making the decision to deploy the paratroopers into Normandy prior to D-Day, when he's being told they could suffer 80 to 90% casualties, but he knows they have to go anyway. Or it's serving as president and being the one who says, I am the one that must make sure that we are following the letter of the law. The Supreme Court says we must desegregate or we cannot have separate but equal. That is what we're going to do. That's my decision. I'm the president. I think the kind of leader that he was formed in the Army, but I think transferred to the civilian structure as president very, very well.
Well, they always say behind a great man is a greater lady. So let's talk about that greater lady.
I fully believe that.
Nice
I am living
transition,
proof. I can assure you.
Let's talk about Mamie. So tell us about her. I can only imagine, first of all, being a soldier's wife. Now she's a general's wife. So, that's over. And I'm thinking back on, Martha Washington, another woman that had to deal with this. And then, oh, okay, that's over. Oh, now president's wife. Tell us about her. I mean, she must have been a pretty strong-willed woman.
Well, Mamie is equally fascinating. And, we are very, we have a couple of sort of sayings that we use here. One is there would have been no President Eisenhower without General Eisenhower. So that, we talk about his military career and his presidency because one was so important to the other. But the other thing we say is, and there would have been no Ike without Mamie. And so they were very different. They grew up in very different scenarios. He came from a family of all boys. She came from a family of all girls. He came from a poor family. She came from a fairly well-to-do family. But once they met and they decided to dedicate themselves to one another and spend their lives together, they were an absolutely incredible team. She considered his career our career, meaning she understood she was absolutely essential to what he was doing, not only as a support for him at home when he's out, in the field for weeks on end, or he's, got a tough assignment to deal with. He needs somebody that he can vent to, or, all of those things are really important. But also just her role there was a very strong social aspect of military officer life at this point, and still is to some degree. And she understood her role in that very well, that she was really important to him in that regard as well. And they really were a great team. She supported him every step of the way. When very early in their career, they had some assignments and some housing that was terrible. They went to Panama, and the housing was horrible, and she was miserable. They're living in the middle of this jungle, and the housing is very substandard. And but she at one point she did leave for a while and go home and then come back. They were just a great team, and she was a very, very admired first lady during the 8 years of the presidency. Just as Eisenhower himself was for 10 or 12 years running the most admired man in America, according to whatever survey was measuring that. She also was always one of the most admired, most popular women in America. She was by his side all the time. She always had a smile on her face. And I think we tend to think of political wives of this era as just kind of standing in the background and just being there for, set dressing or whatever. And that's not the case with Mamie Eisenhower. I don't think it's the case with most of the first ladies, really. A lot of them are far more active than people realize, maybe behind the scenes. But Mamie had causes that mattered to her. She had some kind of a heart condition, so she was very active in raising money for charities that were related to heart health. She campaigned for women running for office, which I think is one of my favorite things about her. She realized it's really important for women to have a voice in government. There were women running for Congress or running for state offices. She campaigned with them and for them. So she was just a really unique lady. She viewed herself as, her job was to support Ike, and she certainly did that, but she had her own personality, her own things that she cared about. And so she was able to sort of have both sides of her personality come together and be, a really good partner for him, and to be a really wonderful first lady for the country.
And I imagine with fashion and things like that as well. But my favorite, one of my favorite quotes from her that just sort of sums up who she was, that I love, is she said, I guess people were talking about her hair, and she said, I like my bangs, or what did she, I like my bangs, I'm not going to cut them, I don't care what anyone thinks of them. Something to that effect, but that just made me just cheer her on.
Yeah,
I loved it.
The Mamie bangs were kind of a fashion statement there, a fashion, staple there for a while. Yeah, and in fact, you can look at photos of Mamie all through her life. The bangs were almost always there. So she definitely liked them, and she definitely didn't care what anybody thought, and she kept them for a very long time. She kept them right up until the end. We have a great video in our museum here of an interview that she did just a few months before she died. So Ike died in 1969. Mamie died in 1979, so she outlived him by 10 years. Shortly before she died, she did this interview with Barbara Walters. And there's Mamie sitting there with the bangs still in this interview in 1979. Barbara Walters asks her, Mrs. Eisenhower, how would you like people to remember your husband? And she's, his courage, his integrity, his dedication to duty. She rattles off all these things that she loved about Ike. And then Barbara Walters says, how would you like them to remember you, Mrs. Eisenhower? And she goes, I never even thought about such a thing. But then the answer that she gave is so perfect. It just encapsulates who she was. She goes, just a good friend. And it's a great video. It's really, really touching, I think, in a nice way. It's really says a lot about her, I think.
And so modest. Absolutely. Love
For
that.
sure. They were both very humble, very modest. No trappings of, position or anything like that with them. They were, Eisenhower when he was president, he loved to grill. He would have people over and he'd grill steaks or burgers or whatever. They were
That's awesome.
very, very normal, down to earth people who just happened to be a general and his wife, or the president and the first lady. They neither one of them had any, pretensions or anything like that.
Right, right.
And they never forgot where they came from too. This place, Abilene, where we're located, this place plays a very central role in Eisenhower's life. Yes, he left here when he was 20 to go to West Point and never really lived here again. Of course, came back to visit, and obviously his library and the museum are here. But this community, this town, played a really important role in his life, to the point where when he came back from World War II, and he's a 5-star general, and he's one of the most recognizable, most admired people in the world, he comes here to visit, and he gives a speech to the people of Abilene, and he says, "The proudest thing I can claim is that I am from Abilene." So, not that I'm a West Point graduate, not that I'm a 5-star general, not that I've, led this crusade to rid Europe of the Nazis, but that I'm from Abilene. And so I think that says a lot about him, and I think it says a lot about this community, which is a wonderful, wonderful community, and a great place for the National Archives to be here working every day at this library.
And if you look on a map, Abilene is pretty much in the center of the country. And what is it? It's literally like 100 miles from the
geographic
actual
center.
geographic center.
Yeah,
of
we're
the
about
US.
100 miles from the geographic center of the entire United States of America, the
Right.
continental United States, I should say. But since I say that, I should also add that Eisenhower, of course, is also the president who admitted Alaska and Hawaii, the 49th and 50th states.
Oh,
That, there's a good connection too.
absolutely.
Yeah, I guess if you drew a bullseye, you'd cover that 100 miles.
Mhm.
You actually drew a bullseye on the map, so it counts. You guys are dead.
It totally counts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can think of ourselves as really being dead center. And again, on the trip that Eisenhower made, coming home from Europe after World War II, before he was here in Abilene and made that speech where he says, "The proudest thing I can claim is that I'm from Abilene," he gave a speech in London at Guildhall. I think it might be sort of like City Hall in London. I'm not sure I'm getting that exactly right, but anyway, a very famous speech where he speaks to the people of London, and he says in that speech, as he's talking about the experience that the United States and the United Kingdom have gone through together in this war, and how important both sides were to this alliance, he makes the statement that I come from the very heart of America. And again, it's perfect, both metaphorically and, literally, because he does come almost from the dead center of the country.
Yep.
Well, we normally end these interviews by asking someone, hey, if there's a place you could go visit to learn more about the history that we just talked about, that's usually the last question.
Yeah, I wonder what
I'm
I'll
feeling
say.
that answer is a little obvious. Yeah,
Well, I will say that, yes, of course, we want people to come here, and the museum here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library was just redone right before the COVID pandemic. So we have exhibits that are practically brand new. It's a world-class museum. It is an absolutely phenomenal museum. I will also give a tip of the cap to my former agency, my colleagues in the National Park Service, who I worked for 25 years before I came over here to the National Archives to work at this library. But Eisenhower National Historic Site in Gettysburg, I mentioned a while ago when I was talking about Camp Colt that Gettysburg becomes important to Eisenhower's story later. He and his wife both, when they were living in Gettysburg during World War I, when he was running Camp Colt, they kind of fell in love with the history and with the area, so that decades later, when, after 30 years of marriage and moving, 20 times, they're finally ready to buy their own home for the first time. They buy a property in Gettysburg, which is their retirement home. They intended to retire much sooner than they did, but then, of course, Eisenhower was president for 8 years, which they weren't expecting when they bought the house. But that property is now a National Historic Site. And believe it or not, I actually worked there like 30 years ago. One summer I spent working in the Eisenhower home, and now to be here in Abilene is kind of coming full circle for me with the Eisenhowers. But anyway, that's a great spot as well. So I highly recommend, if you want to go somewhere other than Abilene to learn about Eisenhower, Ike and Mamie both, and that's a great spot to go as well.
Absolutely. And we'll put the web pages for all of these places in the show notes. And definitely for everyone who wants to go to Gettysburg for the Civil War things, will just stop on over and visit Ike and Mamie while you're at it.
Absolutely. That it's right there, very close to the the battlefield, which of course is kind of all over Gettysburg, but it's a great stop too. And I loved working there 30 years ago, and they've done so much there to improve it and make it a different experience and a better experience now. So I'll give them a recommendation. And there's a new Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. too, which I haven't even seen yet. So on my next trip to D.C., I'll definitely have to go find that. But that's only been open for maybe a couple of years now at this point.
Listen, we covered a bunch of the eastern half of the United States, so you are within a decent drive of one of these places.
Absolutely.
Go and check them out. And as always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So if you want to go check out some behind-the-scenes content, you can go there. And we also do community book giveaways from the books that are written by some of the historians that we speak to. So make sure to check that out at patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. Yeah, and if there's, I know we'll say we'll put it in the show notes, but Todd, if there's anywhere where if someone can't make it out to Abilene to come visit, where can they find you guys online?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we have a great website, eisenhowerlibrary.gov. Of course, there's tons of information on there about the Eisenhowers. We have put a lot of documents and historic photos on the website, so people can do some research from home. Nothing can compare to, of course, coming here and spending time in the reading room and having our archival team bring you the actual documents. It's a great experience. But there's a lot of stuff to see on the website. We do also have a kind of a virtual tour on the website, so people can see what our campus looks like, and they can even take a sort of a virtual tour through the museum as well.
Oh, very cool.
And they can find us on social media, of course, because
yes.
It's 2025. Everybody's got social media. So, we're at Ike Library on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.
Perfect. We'll put all those links in the show notes.
Thanks.
And thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, well, you got more Eisenhower than you ever thought there was or that you ever wanted to know, probably. But hey, that's why we're here.
It's left me wanting more.
Yes.
That's a good answer. I'll take that.